Welcome to the 201 lecture on Plato, Plato's Republic. My name is Eric. My expertise is politics and philosophy, so I approach this text from that angle. In general, though, I try to give you an overview, but my main theme here will be Plato's construction of the city and his notion of justice as a foundation that he seeks to build it upon, and the philosophical themes and ideas that ultimately organize his thoughts as a foundation for the city, his metaphysics or his philosophy of being. So I'm going to go through this. You have a handout which will give you some of the definitions. It also has, I believe, the cave and the divided line, and we'll get to that in association with the PowerPoint as well. So let me begin. So Plato's Republic is a work of the 4th century BC. The work is famous for its discussion of justice, of the timeless forms or ideas, Plato's forms, and philosopher kings. My intention today is to focus primarily on Plato's defense of an ethical theory of justice in and against Thrasymachus, his opponent in the early stages of the Republic, and the philosophical and political enterprises, arguments, Plato finds himself getting into to defend such a theory of justice. Before I jump into the dialogue, it is important to set the context of the debate, especially for those of you for whom Plato and the Republic are new. On the one hand, we have the sophists, like Thrasymachus, who believe that there is no truth except what humans make, and that democracy, right, allows each to express their own truth. There is no great truth, no one truth, so each of us should have a right to express their own truth. On the other hand are those who, like Plato, argue for a permanent realm of ideas, which provides a standard for truth anywhere and at any time, which can only be understood and applied by a philosophical elite. And of course, this is resoundingly in opposition against any idea of democracy. It's an elitism, and we'll see Plato's philosophical elitism emerge with his notion of the philosopher kings. With this, we have introduced the two camps of the sophists and the Platonics, and we may begin our descent into the dialogue. At the end of the day, we can look at the Republic as a whole as a theory of an ideal political community, or polis, as Plato called it, based on a version of justice, and judge its worth from this point of view. Plato's spokesman in the dialogue, Socrates, was actually his real-life teacher. And as we will see, his teacher's life and death had a great influence on his theory of justice and power. It is Thrasymachus' challenge which largely sets the stage for the Republic. Thrasymachus argues that justice is nothing else than the interest of the stronger, of those who rule, and therefore might makes right. Might makes right, which is as much as to say that justice is a lie or a myth to justify the existing status quo. Yet Thrasymachus' position is rejected by Plato's primary spokesperson in the dialogue, Socrates. Socrates is the character speaking for Plato in the dialogue, at least that's my understanding, who argues that the art of rulership never takes the interest of the ruler as primary. By definition, a ruler doesn't rule for himself, but in the interest of the ruled. Despite his refutation of Thrasymachus' position, Socrates has yet to provide a positive definition of justice and sets out to find one. With this, the great work of the Republic has begun. Having arrived at the task of defining justice as a good in itself, regardless of benefit, Socrates and his main discussants, two of them, Glaucon and Adeimantus, agree to take up the search. They agree to search first at the macro level of the state to find justice in the state, and only later to return to the micro level of the individual, so they would find it more easily in the larger body. This deductive procedure seeks the individual through the lens of the larger body politic or the polis, and is oriented towards viewing the part specifically as part of the whole, right? Plato's emphasis upon unity and the whole. We'll see more about that later. Socrates moves towards an understanding of justice considered aside from its rewards, with a view to the essential good and evil which justice and injustice work in the individual who possesses them. All agree upon this as a necessary route to disprove the common view held by Thrasymachus that might makes right, and that justice is the prerogative of the powerful. Thus, Socrates and his friends set out to prove that justice is not only the best for the happiness it brings, right, but is best in and of itself regardless of its consequences, right? And this begins their journey and quest for the ideal form of the political state. Socrates starts by laying out the economic organization necessary for such a state to exist. He lays out the basic divisions of labor, which he held as the conditions of life allowing a community to flourish. Merchants, workers, and buyers all interact to provide the variety of goods available and necessary for life. Each type of labor, Socrates argues, must be performed by those whose nature best fit the work, such that the division of labor most effectively utilizes the human resources available in and through its citizens. As the city's needs and wants expand into a city of unlimited desires, right? Glaucon's City of Pigs, he calls it a City of Pigs, one of the Socrates' interlocutors, his discussants. There will be demand for an expansion of lands in order to provide for growing wants and luxury. As the city expands and its wants expands, it's going to need to expand into neighboring territories. With this, Socrates informs us that they have discovered war to be derived from causes which are also the causes of almost all evils in states, private as well as public. And this is really Plato's foremost enemy, is the problem of civil war and warfare, and this is what he's really trying to save the city from, and we'll see that later in terms of his organization of the city as a whole. From the beginnings of the search for justice in the state, the harmonization of differences and the suppression of conflict are taken as constitutional principles of political order. Unity, not diversity, appears to be Plato's primary concern. To the end of material and territorial expansion, a place of military training will be necessary, and the division of labor is again applied so that those who are most fit fill out the army. Socrates turns to the analogy of the courage of dogs as epitomizing spirit or bravery, thumos in the Greek, thumos, in order to imagine a class of soldiers who will prove dangerous to enemies, but soft and welcoming to fellow citizens. The most fitting education for the soldiers, Socrates finds in a training of music and gymnastics, typical of the age and in the region. A strong program of censorship is set up in order to encourage some themes and to repress others. All harmful examples of passion, irrationality, cowardice from the poets or the myths, the Greek myths, are to be eliminated from the education of the youth, who will become the brave defenders of the polis. The state may produce myths yet, however, and the rulers may censor and lie for the good of the public in general. Plato now pushes the dialogue onward to ask the primary political question: who should rule? Who shall rule? He begins his search for the best rulers in holding that the best amongst the old must rule the young. This elite should be for the common people, but not amongst or from the common people. At this point, Plato fashions his political myth of the earth-born caste, his famous myth of the metals. Here, youth must be taught that their training and early education was experienced in the Greek earth, which has yielded them a specific nature, gold, silver, or bronze, and that the Greek soil from which they were born is their true mother, to be loved and defended from enemies, right? The identification with a class of metals will dictate a citizen's rank in society and political status. So we have a caste system evolving in Plato's city here. The purity of the castes is to be preserved at all costs, in that there is nothing which they should so anxiously guard, Plato writes, as the purity of race. The highest ranks of the guardians find their purpose in the protection of the Constitution, which takes as its primary purpose not the disproportionate happiness of any one class, but the greatest good, the greatest happiness of the whole. At this point in his development, Plato is working up the basics of his state from its very foundations, in starting at the level of appetite, of desire, with material production and consumption. Plato addressed his city first in its least ideal aspect. That is, he works towards the ideal of justice from the lowest realms of material exchange and human appetite. Now, with the education and role of the warrior class, he has moved upwards from the appetite and desires of the working class to the passions and emotions, the second level of the warring class, the second class in society from the bottom up. In contemplating, moving forward, in contemplating his four highest virtues of courage, wisdom, justice, and temperance, we're still looking for justice, Socrates declares justice to be discovered in the very divisions of the state. Justice is seen in the differentiation of the city into its various specialized tasks. Justice, then, is each part doing what it does well. Right? We have an organism, a polis family here. In terms of class functioning, this means the laboring class obeying, the brave warriors defending, and the wise guardians, who we will soon be introduced to, ruling. Each of these in harmony with the other, creating the overall good of the whole, right? An organism, organic unity. Having found justice in the state, Socrates now returns to the question of justice in the individual person, which is, of course, his ultimate goal, at least from the outset. To begin, Socrates moves to articulate the structures of the soul, right? What are those parts of the individual? We saw them in the state, right? Now we're going to see them in the individual person. Those structures of the self which he claims make up any and all persons. The three classes found in the state have an equivalence at the level of the soul and are translated to appetites, emotions, and intellect, right? Plato's tripartite model of the soul, or the psyche. In short, these are the animal, the emotional, and the intellectual. And the just state, as the just state goes, so goes the individual. It will not cheat, nor lie, nor steal, so long as each part of the soul carries out its function and its business unimpeded and in harmony, right, without interfering with its counterparts. It is only, Plato writes, with the meddlesomeness and interference of the inferior in the rising up of a part of the soul against the whole, that the soul is rendered into corruption and deformity. So just like civil war in the state, there can be a kind of psychical instability and division within the self that can also lead to upsetting the harmony of the individual and leading to unhappiness, right? Justice in the soul, as in the state, means that each part of him is doing its own business, whether in ruling or being ruled. With this, Socrates declares that Thrasymachus' equation of domination with strength, well-being and happiness, right? Power equals happiness, of the individual has been defeated, as it serves no one to be miserable and sickly either of body and soul. What does this mean? This means that when one part of our soul rules, dominates the other parts, the individual can't be happy either. Therefore, it can't be right for any one part to dominate another. The soul of the just must find harmony within itself, and if any part is dominant, this imbalances the whole. Happiness becomes impossible, and misery is the result. So Thrasymachus must be wrong. In response to his colleagues' insistence at this point, they now return to the question of the state. Glaucon and Adeimantus aren't completely satisfied. Declaring the issue of class conflict in their city to be resolved, as each part embraces its role as well as that of the others, Socrates here restates his confidence in the overall harmonization of the classes and citizens where all are of one opinion about what is near and dear to them. They all tend towards a common end. And again, we have the theme of communism, which we'll see later, organism, and political unity of the polis family emerging here as the primary interest for Plato. With this, Glaucon moves to ask how Socrates has actually made the case that their ideal state is also possible, given history and human nature, as they and we perhaps know it. With this question, the quintessential Platonic moment of the dialogue has arrived. Here we begin to fathom with Plato the interaction of the timeless universal ideal of the good on the one side and its historical manifestation in the form of justice in the polis on the other, and their prospects for integration. That is, how do we make compatible the ideal and the real? And we'll get into what this ideal is in just a moment, right? These universal ideas. With so much of the life and ordering of the polis family, right, the organism of the state that we've talked about, some of which I've left out in terms of Plato's ideas of the common holding of wives, the communism of property, and the organization of mating. He has very elaborate rituals for how people will be mating, right? Very interesting. What has arrived is a consideration of the viability of the ideal state in time, in history, right? How do we make the ideal applicable to the real world we live in, right? Does its status, this ideal city, as an ideal, make it a historical impossibility? Does a conflict between his ideal and the real world we live in run through time so as to make his aspirations foolish, as many have and continue to claim to this day, right? That is, to what universal and timeless map can reason refer in order to plot the good political course through history that Plato aspires to? Where can he find his compass of universal ideals which trump what we see with our eyes, right? Where can we find this ideal? How do we see it? It is the metaphysical, right, question of being, of ultimate truth, right? It is the metaphysical question of the conceptual foundations of justice for the polis which Plato now has to address. The interplay of the real and the ideal, Socrates' third wave, he declares it as the most difficult and greatest wave that he has to overcome, is now tackled by Plato in the Republic. History, Socrates admits, right, returning to the narrative, is clearly in rebellion against the realization of his idealistic words and dreams. Nevertheless, he claims that since his arguments aspire to their ideal state, there is no need to limit himself to experience and precedent. Just because such a state has never existed does not mean that it is not ideal, and if it is ideal, it clearly ought to be possible. Conditional upon this great wave of political transformation being brought about, Plato, through his spokesperson in the dialogue, Socrates, makes perhaps his most famous claim. Until philosophers are kings, or the kings and princes of the world have the spirit and power of philosophy, and political greatness and wisdom meet in one, cities will never have rest from their evils. With this bold statement, Plato makes the philosophical condition for his political program clear. It is this disclosure of the ideal through the philosopher's political authorship with which Plato seeks to establish true political authority and make it concrete in the real world of his history and experience. Plato here sounds his clear endorsement of the rule of a philosopher class over those commoner natures who are destined to be ruled, right? Our liberal convictions start to make us uncomfortable here. So these are difficult words for our liberal ears to hear. Driven on by Glaucon's concerns as to who these true philosophers are, given the bad reputation of philosophy and philosophers in his day, Plato moves to distinguish his philosophers from what he considers to be the cheap imitations of his time. From their contemplation of timeless ideas, philosophers emerge to a status of a very different quality and nature than their diverse fellow citizens, right? They're almost a different species. Above human desire and fallibility, free of fear and vanity, Plato's spectators of all time and all existence, right, preside over the polis, the city, as philosophical prophets for the political community. I specifically put the word philosophical before prophet here because we shouldn't imagine it as some kind of theological prophecy, though that would later be something that would be taken on in the Neoplatonic and Aristotelian influences on Islamic, Jewish, and Christian thought. But let's leave the theological out of this. For Plato, it's about philosophy and reason, right? That's the type of prophecy we're going to be talking about. We learn that the true philosopher for Plato, philosophia, is a lover of truth first and foremost, right? Very definition of philosophy, lover of wisdom. They are those who stand in strongest contrast with the politicians and sophists who are concerned with nothing more than persuasion, money, and power. These commercial philosophers and orators of his day. The greatest corrupting force for politics, right, that which is to be blamed on the sophists and the politicians, Plato informs us, is the mighty strong beast of public opinion and ignorance, which is the basis of everyday politics as they know it, and perhaps we know it here in Lebanon and beyond. It is this condition which has brought philosophy to worldly shame, and is this which Plato seeks to remedy by restoring philosophy to its rightful place of political leadership. Right? Having redeemed philosophy from its bad reputation in this short transition, Socrates now returns to consider the philosophical training necessary to restore philosophers and philosophy to their good name and to a ruling position in the polis. Against the real-world politicians and sophists who we just spoke about, who think only of reputation, persuasion, and wealth, Plato presents a philosopher who keeps his gaze upon the permanent realm of ideas and is interested only in truth. The rule of the universal idea, which we will soon be introduced to in the forums, is made the model for the correct ordering of the polis, of the city. As such, the rule of these philosophical few, this elite, requires Plato to delve into a philosophical defense of truth and its basis in these perfect ideas which he considers in terms of his theory of the forms, his theory of ideas. Though the terms of the theory of ideal forms are in play here, we're talking about them, the outlines of such a theory remain wholly beyond the bounds of the text thus far. We really don't know what they are as of yet, right, at this point. This stage of the dialogue reveals a dramatic ascendance, a moving upwards, from the allegorical language of appearances towards Plato's language of the science of dialectic, of philosophical thinking. That is, from the world of the senses, we are moving upwards to the world of the mind, and that is the world that Plato seeks to use to anchor his political leadership. Such a progress in the text mirrors the liberation of the mind, which is witnessed in the upcoming allegory of the cave, which we'll momentarily go through. The moment has arrived to describe the true nature of philosophical practice in terms of its innermost idea and content. What is philosophy and how is it practiced? Where the first education provided only a general sketch of the education of the philosophical rulers in terms of gymnastic and music, a second education is now begun, which Plato bases on his central metaphysical scheme or theory of reality in the Republic. The ultimate unity of the system of ideas, or forms, as we will soon speak about them, becomes the intellectual essence and ruling principle of the polis's political architecture and educational system. Yet, as Adamantus brings out at this point, the problem remains as to how the ideal itself, right, may be made to replace the corrupt Athenian reality and the poverty of democracy, for which Plato has become such a famous witness. That is, how can we come to know and realize the ideal, right, when there is so much resistance to it in the real world of corruption, common sense, hedonism, and democracy, right? All of these are the problem that Plato wants to build a ladder so he can jump over. To answer this, Plato turns to a theory of knowledge and ideas in order to establish the foundation, the philosophical method that his guardians can use to rule. First, through access to universal ideas, and then by translating them into political practice. So first, Plato wants to create a philosophical training of the mind that allows people to see the truth, and then to turn around and take that philosophical understanding and apply it to political organization. And as such, we come to the divided line, which you have on your fly sheet. He here delivers, with the divided line, he delivers his theory of a hierarchy of the intelligible and the sensible, that which can be known by the mind versus that which can be known by the senses. And these are two worlds, a two-world solution, if you like, in Plato's thought. Plato's line is divided, as we can see. On the lower part, we see that the divisible is divided into belief and imagination at the bottom, and the upper part, the intelligible world, that world which can only be known with the mind, is divided into the realm of mathematics or intellect and pure reason. At the highest level of reason, or dialectic as Plato called it, thinking works with pure ideas which acquire truth of the whole, and the highest idea for Plato, the idea of the good. Reason brings together all parts of experience into the one truth of being, right? That's why it's a metaphysics, right? Being. And in the political realm, into the state which unifies all citizens, right? So all parts of the world in metaphysics are united into one theory of being, and this becomes a model for the unity that will be ultimately applied to the polis in bringing all citizens, all particular citizens, into unified one or being of the polis, right? So metaphysics first, philosophy first, afterwards politics, right? Very unmodern, to say the least. This knowledge of the highest idea is grounded, the good, right, again, is grounded on the ultimate principle earlier discussed, right? From this absolute point of reference, thinking may once again descend from the idea of the good, from pure reason, descend to the lower levels of experience to bring order to the diversity of phenomena registered by the senses in terms of knowledge, or registered by perception of the city in terms of political disorder. Right? How do we remedy the problem of disorder in the city? And this, again, for Plato, order is the calling of the day. This hierarchy of understanding is built upon four levels to which Plato assigns four mental faculties, which descend in the following order. Right? Pure intelligence is the level of dialectic. Right? Active intelligence is that of mathematics. Faith is belief, at the level of belief. And at the lowest level is the level of illusion or imagination, right? Where we're not really seeing the truth, we're seeing a reflection of the truth. If the line divides true knowledge from false opinion, right, the upper levels of intellect and reason being related to the truth and belief and imagination being alienated from the truth, then the implications await application to the realm of politics. How do we take this model of an understanding of reality and apply it back down to the polis, right? And this is what Plato's project is, I think, ultimately about. Plato here, through Socrates, speaks of a progress of consciousness, a progress of understanding, of awareness, through which philosophy may take a foothold in the real world and begin the process of bringing the heavenly ideal down for political realization. Thus, the famous allegory of the cave, right, is set off to describe the actual ideological, right, political, and social conditions within which human consciousness is held captive, right? Diverted from the truth and ultimately perverted, right? Insofar as we are stuck in the cave, which we'll deal with in a minute, we can never come to know the higher levels of reason and intellect. We're always stuck in the level of illusion. So we'll come to the cave in just a minute. The divided line provided Plato with a ladder to imagine the liberation of the captives of the cave to the light of truth, right? To liberate them to the light of truth, from the lowest levels of the line to the highest. And thus, we come to the cave, which some of you may have already come in contact with in popular media or movies, etc. And let's talk about it briefly. In Plato's cave, or society as he would see it now or in his day, humans unknowingly carry out underground lives in the dark. And that would be at the very bottom of the cave, right, where we see people being strapped down, though it's hard to see in this particular image. Their arms and heads are bound, and gazes are fixed upon a wall cast with the shadows of real objects. A group of presenters cast these shadows upon the wall by manipulating objects and puppets between a bright fire and the wall where the shadows fall. So it's something like a cinema, a puppet show. And it sounds a little bit like television. We're seeing an image of reality and not reality itself. For the audience, the shadow, or citizens of the state and members of society, in terms perhaps understood in terms of conditioning or social conditioning for Plato, for this audience, the shadows cast on the wall are taken as the real truth, right, as the true reality. Voices are projected into the cinema in association with the shadows, right, it's a proper puppet show, and are taken as coming from the shadow objects themselves. So we come to, like, celebrity culture, for example. We come to see these people as real representatives of knowledge, right? And yet they are nothing but the intermediaries with knowledge and not knowledge itself. Certainly not representatives or self-representation of the world, right? This social and sensory education amounts to the world of nurture and would perhaps be best represented by education, law, art, and other social and political institutions which form our collectively held worldviews. So this is a world of social development and social understanding which gives us our map of reality, right? But for Plato, that map is still deformed, alienated from the real reality that's out there. We're still living in the cave. We need to get out of that, right? Even when set free from this captivity to custom, convention, and sense, right, our conditioning within society, these former prisoners refuse to give up the lessons of their previous captivity. Even if people are offered the escape, they refuse. They want to stay within the cave. If they are guided toward the light of actual truth and reality through philosophy, they suffer as the eye trained to darkness does from the brightness of the sun, right? They're not ready for it. Should the philosopher offer them orientation and inform the former captives, those members of the cave, that what they now see is the real world, they refuse and reassert their former shadow knowledge from the cave, right? Their social conditioning is they hold on to it very strongly. Should these same captives be finally dragged out of the cave and into the direct light of the sun in philosophy and made to look into the truth, they would be blinded and go mad. And they're simply not ready for it. The shock is too great from Plato's point of view, right? For those who escape, finally, those philosophers who actually escape the limits of the cave, their new point of reference will take time to adjust to. It's a whole new world, right? Slowly, they come to see the light of day, or the truth of being and the good, the idea of the good, or the sun, as we see in the image, right, the graphic, without discomfort. Once having come to see the sunshine of the highest truth, the idea of the good, as we talked earlier, they naturally come to understand its primacy, right, as a compass for human judgment, both philosophical and political. They've discovered a whole new basis to see the world. Having come to this startling escape, the newly liberated person, right, these philosophers, now set their sights upon the continued captivity of the remaining cave dwellers. They now wish to return to the cave and convince their former fellows of the freedom and truth that exists and waits for them at the upper world beyond the cave, right? Sounds a little bit like Neo in the Matrix, getting out and seeing things as they are. Plato here asserts that the conversion of men's minds to philosophy from the prejudices of opinion and appearance, right, social convention and conditioning, is made all the more difficult by the conventions of common sense and the demands of tradition and custom. We are stopped. These are obstacles for us to see philosophical reality, to see reality philosophically, see the truth of reality clearly, our social conditioning. Such a return to the cave, Plato warns, would be laughed at as ridiculous and likely denounced as heretical by virtue of the philosopher's challenge to the customs of the traditional polis, right? The philosopher here becomes something of a terrorist when he returns to the polis, to the cave, because nobody wants to hear what he has to say. Such a mission, Plato makes clear, would likely end in the philosopher's death, who would be treated as a revolutionary enemy of the state, threatening the status quo, right? And here's the punchline. Clearly, Plato had not forgotten the personal experience and lesson of his teacher's plight, Socrates, who was sentenced to death for his heterodox, unorthodox views. And that is the Socrates of the Republic, it's himself. In Plato's city, the statesman requires the ultimate knowledge of this idea of the good, right, this emancipation through philosophy, to be capable of rational political judgment, right, to be worthy of leading. The prison or cave of social and sensory experience, right, it's not merely the cave of social conditioning, but also our captivity to our senses, our five senses that limits our mind's ability to see beyond and to see what's really true, because the ideas exist independently of the material world of the senses. The prison or cave of social and sensory experience is no more than the world of appearances and public opinion, right? And having read the imprint of internal truth in the final idea of the good, the philosopher returns to the cave of the polis, ideally, for Plato, with the blueprint for its reform and ultimate perfection. In the ideal polis, the philosopher must rule as king and as the one who has exclusively received the highest education. In this way, Plato delivers his justification as to how one who has been reared to the guardian class and has attained the highest happiness of truth must now be persuaded to give up this happiness and return to the difficulty, the problems, the struggle and stress of the captivity of his fellows in the cave. He has to go back and take up that struggle, right? We can think of a variety of great leaders or historical figures who certainly returned, who made this effort and suffered greatly for it. Certainly Christ comes to mind as somebody who had this sort of a mission. With this, the true guardians have been found, and Plato has considers his case for the practicality of his city complete. He now believes with the establishment of this foundation for the city, for its vision, for its leadership, in the philosopher and philosophical knowledge, Plato considers himself to have completed his structuring of the polis, right? The original goal was to find happiness in the individual. It has turned around and become a project for formulating an ideal city, right? They kind of got carried away. Where Thrasymachus had originally argued that rulership is the art of exploiting the ruled, right? And that will sound familiar to some of us. Plato has turned this position around to its opposite so that rulers themselves are committed to the rule of the forms, the ideas, as an ultimate ethical authority. In this sense, the philosopher is for Plato as much a political agent as a prophet, conducting the sight of the community up to the light of the sun of ideas through the practice of philosophy and philosophical thinking, also known as dialectic. The absence of the heavenly city of the ideal forms in history, right? Our absence of access to this ideal city is thus a kind of permanent purgatorial existence. We can never be satisfied in the cities and forms of governance that we know in the world as we've seen them. They're never going to be satisfactory, right? Short of taking this philosophical trip, this pilgrimage. This condition witnesses the tragic alienation of humanity, for Plato, from its own essential nature and spiritual potential, right? Until we actually have this type of revolutionary change in line with these philosophical ideals that are the ultimate truth of the reality that we know, that we ought to know, we will never be satisfied down here in the muck and mess and stress of history. We're stuck, right? That's the purgatory. We must admit, though, and here's by way of a critique, a critical gesture, that Platonic justice as we see it completed here is not attained through the willing agency or awareness of its citizens, nor their consultation. Rather, it is found at the level of the organization of the polis as a whole, so as to bring citizens into conformity with the ideal which few citizens alone can see. In this rule of the one of justice over the many of freedom, right? Plato set his city against what he sees as the ugly and inevitable consequences of democratic pluralism, which he saw as a slippery slope on the way to civil war and civil instability, strife. The realization of the ideal polis is brought about through the spiritual unification of the potentialities of its citizens, right? And not merely through an education which takes those potentialities as ends in themselves. In this sense, citizens exist for the city, and not the city for the sake of the citizens, right? They are cells in a kind of brute or brash sense. They are cells in a larger organism or a larger organ. This distinction draws a marked line between the most basic individualist presumptions of modern liberal education and Plato's radical concern with preservation of the harmony and unified soul of the polis family. Despite this critical note, Plato's concern was first and foremost with the frequency of strife, conflict, and civil war of his day, and there's clearly little value in dismissing, wholesale, his political thought in favor of our own ethical standards and those of the contemporary world. Nonetheless, it is difficult not to see class prejudice in Plato's political order, as it is often explicitly expressed in his distaste, his dislike for the middle and working classes, right? He held these to be beneath contempt. They needed to be reformed. So let me bring this to a close. To bring all this together, the structure and design of the Republic may be seen as a reflection of the revolutionary implications of the allegory of the cave and the hierarchy of knowledge illustrated in the doctrine of the divided line. The movement of the dialogue from the conventional sphere of becoming, of change, to that of ideal unity and permanence, right, unchangingness in being, in the highest idea of the good, reveals a teaching, both a pedagogical or teaching strategy, as well as a philosophical one, at work behind the dialogue. Plato slowly refocuses our eyes from the historical level of custom and convention and sense to the higher ideal horizon of philosophy. That is, from the earthly to the heavenly, and this is the ride, the journey that dramatically and sequentially that the dialogue itself takes. The overall build-up, this overall build-up from convention to ideal, is a reflection of the movement of the soul, from the appetites through the passions, with perfection finally attained in reason and philosophical understanding. Each of these represented by a specific class in society. The myth of the earth-born citizens, those who were born in the Greek soil, the bronze, the silver, the gold, secures his hierarchy with greatest concern for class integration and harmony, right? Harmony within the polis. Here, caste is given mythic legitimacy where humans are by nature born to a specific class, a caste system, right? Everybody knows what caste is, a caste system, right? You have your place in society, and that is where you will stay. Thus far, Plato has remained within the bounds of conventional Greek values and has yet to provide a justification for his hierarchy in argument. The search for an ideal city and of an ideal justice within it necessarily creates the need to justify his educational and class constructions. They're not satisfying on their own. With this, the center of the dialogue makes its appearance at the end of the dialogue. And the second state of the Republic is begun with Plato's plan to found a city on a metaphysical system of universal ideals, his forms that we talked about, at least in sketch, and these forms are intended to give meaning to all of the educational, legal, economic, and institutional arrangements which have thus far been outlined. The dialogue has fully moved from the transition from the conventional ideal, from the low areas of Greek experience to the high lands, right? Plato's longed-for ideal of the mind, in the one of permanent being, that is the highest form of the good and truth. The city should reflect the order and intellect that is only knowable, right, by reference to that ideal model that is the good in itself. A pure idea which stands outside of time, beyond the senses, and which is unchanging. It is almost a divine idea, but I don't want to make reference to the notion of divinity here. This arrival of the soul of the dialogue signals the introduction of Plato's core philosophical and political program. Plato's protagonist, Socrates, then sailed into the wind, right? The metaphysical challenge, to meet the greatest of the waves which confronted his construction of the polis with this greatest of challenges, the question. That question being, what is the ideal ground, foundation, and form of legitimate authority that only the mind, only philosophy can know, and which has never been historically seen? It is not until this moment that the philosopher has played any substantial role in his construction of the city thus far. Everyday human experience, how does this come about? How do we gain access to philosophical understanding and training? Everyday human experience stimulates an inner awareness of the paradox of the one and the many, right? Plurality and unity, the state and the citizens, the many of the senses and the one of the good, of being. And these have both philosophical and political implications. Only with this basic experience of the one and the many, and its latter education, does the mind arrive at the conflict between the senses, the sensual world, and the mental worlds, right? So as to be capable of gaining the philosophical height and perspective needed to witness the ideal forms which order the world, right? We must ascend and transcend the senses in order to see how the elements of the senses are themselves meaningfully organized in the world of the senses, right? If we just look with the senses, we will never understand the order, the implicit order that unifies them. This evolution Plato took as a model for the foundation of an elite philosophical education to raise the mind from its captivity in the many impressions of the senses, and by extension to ultimately emancipate the polis as a whole from the wants, interests, and opinions of its many members, which plague it with internal strife and conflict. Where Plato strove to bring the heavenly pattern of the ideal down to earth, philosophical and political legitimacy are intertwined, as to bring an end to the soul's captivity in the purgatory of the shifting sands of public opinion and sensory perception, where appearance tyrannizes over truth. That's a big mouthful. I should try to explain that. Right? Philosophical legitimacy, actually I've kind of said it. Philosophical legitimacy gives us a basis to overcome our captivity in society, to the conditioning we have within society, to our senses, our slavery to our senses, to our desires, in order to overcome this cycle of karma, this karmic cycle, to use a Buddhist metaphor, to overcome our captivity to social knowing, historical knowing, the limitations of these conventions. We need to gain access to philosophical understanding, because it is the only perspective that allows us to see how these things are meaningful, not merely within a particular system of understanding or historical moment, but between them, between all of them, because it is a fixed and timeless point of view, right? The good in itself, being the highest idea of the forms, is unchanging. It is not subject to material change or historical change or social, right? Plato's grand narrative of the state, then, is first and foremost a project where political problems are subjected to the logic of philosophical resolution. The cave dwellers to which he addressed himself are his fellow Athenians in his day, and the Greeks and his Greeks, his fellow Greeks. And the Republic itself becomes the educational exercise of the philosopher who has returned to the cave to seek the spiritual emancipation of his countrymen, right? What he says in the book, the guideline he gives for returning to the cave from once the philosopher has ascended to the light of day and returned, Plato is himself doing. There's a recursive aspect, right? Thus, Plato, the author of the Republic, is the self-same heroic philosopher king of the Republic. In many ways, its vengeance is set on redeeming the honor and spirit of Plato's revered teacher, Socrates. Socrates, the real-life Socrates, who was executed, killed, given, poisoned for his philosophical views and teachings. To end, we may ask, and I'll put these up as questions you may take away, whether Plato has really made a persuasive case for his ideal forms, number one, and whether we can agree or are comfortable with his political implementation of this political system, right? I leave you with that, and thank you for your patience.